Welcome back to our Journalist Roundtable. Let's talk about Europe in this segment. Philippe, the big focus of attention this past summer has been the Greek debt crisis. A new Greek government tried to take on the giants of Europe, and by some accounts, the Greeks appear to have been forced to capitulate and swallow some bitter medicine. Were there any winners and losers in this battle?
I don't really think there were any winners. I mean, obviously the Greek government set out to challenge the prevailing orthodoxy in the Eurozone and to obtain debt relief. And so far it's failed to achieve either of those. What has happened is that capital controls have been imposed and banks were shut down and the economy brought to its knees. And now a government that was elected to end austerity is implementing a huge austerity. At the same time, you see that the way that they were forced to capitulate is that Germany basically threatened to force them out of the Eurozone, and that has created all sorts of political differences and troubles, not least with France, for which that idea was unthinkable. And so now you're seeing a big debate about what kind of union is the Eurozone. Is it a monetary union heading towards much closer fiscal and political integration, potentially eventually a Eurozone government? Or is it basically just a very rigid fixed exchange rate regime from which countries potentially can be forced out? And I think that is the big debate for the next few months.
Afshin, Germany did play very tough during these negotiations over the Greek debt crisis. Angela Merkel was not in a mood for compromise at all. But there have been questions being asked about Germany's behavior. The New York Times says Germany undercut its moral authority with what it called its contemptuous tone. That was the New York Times. The Guardian says there's been a major fallout between Paris and Berlin, as Philippe just alluded to a moment ago, over how the Greek crisis was handled. Was Germany bullying a much smaller, weaker country?
Yeah, I think the New York Times had it right about the contemptuous tone. I think at some level, what Germany was doing, in a sense, was setting a wall around other political parties like the Syriza party in Greece. You know, populist, leftist, coming into power, potentially calling for a change and upending the order. And Germany said, we need to stop this right here. And one German official said Alexis Tsipras needs to decide whether he wants to be the leader of Syriza, his party, or the prime minister of Greece. And ultimately, he chose to be the prime minister of Greece. Having said that, I think there was a contemptuous tone. Now, Germany, after having secured this agreement, is going to have to agree to some form of debt relief. Greece is not going to grow itself out of this debt pile that it's in right now. And without some form of debt relief, you know, we can't envision a scenario whereby Greece continues to live under this form of austerity for years and years.
They've just kicked the can down the road.
They have, yes.
Weihua, how did China see this debt crisis that was unfolding in Europe? I mean, how much could Beijing have done, for instance, to bail out Greece? There is the new China-led bank, the AIIB, the Asia Investment and Infrastructure Bank. Could it have helped?
Well, I think China definitely would help, but I don't know to what extent, because China is not going to single-handedly do that. I mean, the large part will depend on EU and the rest of the world, I would say. I think the Chinese interest is very much to see Greece and EU work out a deal so that, you know, the economic stability is being maintained. I mean, we cannot afford another sort of a destability after 2008. I mean, the crisis. So I think we hope, I mean, they have the talks going well, I mean, between, yeah.
Okay, I want to change subjects now, talk about the next US president. The election campaign seems to be well underway. Well, it never ends in this country. There's an election campaign all the time. We had the first debate for the Republican presidential hopefuls. That was here in the United States on Thursday night. How much interest is there in China at this stage?
Well, very little, I would say. A lot of people don't know the candidates in the primary. There's just too many of them. If you just look at the night, 5 o'clock, you know, at 9 o'clock.
But there is name recognition. Hillary
Yes.
Clinton, Donald Trump, they must know.
Oh, definitely. I don't think Donald Trump is recognized for the, you know, the right reason. I mean, you know, people know, I mean, he is rich, okay, as he claims himself. But people, I mean, definitely feel very good about the Bush. I mean, the Jeb Bush.
Right.
I mean, the Bush family has a great knowledge of China. I mean, so the senior Bush, I mean, the George W. Bush. So I think as long as the U.S.-China relations is concerned, people very much, believe Bush is good for the relationship. Obviously, they know. I mean, Clinton has a knowledge about China too. I mean, a lot of the context. Yeah, but that's so far, I think, it. But I think from the Thursday night debate, I would say, in my personal view, I would, probably the John Kasich and the Ohio governor, the Ron Paul, their sort of views, arguments would more sort of identified viewers maybe in China, like me here.
Right, Philippe, what about Europe? Is Europe as bemused as we are here over the antics of Donald Trump, or is it at this stage a big yawn, just a US domestic issue?
Oh, I think certainly in Britain, there's a huge interest, there always is, in US presidential elections. The cover of The Guardian today is obviously about Donald Trump and the first Republican debate. And certainly he says such outrageous things that it makes a lot of noise, including on this side of the Atlantic. I think there's an interesting parallel because the kind of things that he's saying, the sort of anti-immigrant, anti-establishment populism, has an echo in Europe in the various anti-establishment, anti-immigrant parties like the UK Independence Party here in Britain or the National Front in France. How credible a voice he is as an anti-establishment candidate is another thing, but certainly many of the sentiments that he expresses have an echo over here.
And Philippe, I'm wondering if there's anything in the European press about the fact that there could be a Bush and a Clinton on the ballot paper when the election comes round. Is this, the kind of two royal families here in the United States saying that we are now entitled to take over?
Certainly the fact that, a country of 300+ million ends up with having sort of two dynasties lording it over the two main parties is somewhat incongruous. And you would think that in a country which claims to have a social mobility and which claims to have an open political system, that there would be a wider pool of talent. Certainly it helps in terms of name recognition. Like my Chinese counterpart, there's bemusement at most of the Republican candidates. Everyone knows who Hillary Clinton is, and everyone certainly knows the Bush name.
Leela, this is how the Huffington Post, which, as you know, is a very popular online newspaper, this is how it summarized the positions of those candidates, those Republican candidates who were in the debate on Thursday night here in the United States. It said they all vowed to re-invade Iraq, send troops to Syria, spy on mosques here in America, and get tough with Iran by scrapping President Barack Obama's diplomatic approach. This looks like the Republicans want to go back to the era of George Bush, doesn't it?
It does. And in France, the reaction here is bemusement. Amusement, really, because this is very early stages, obviously, of the Republican race. But there would be some alarm for the few French men and women who were watching the debate last night on the complete lack of understanding, I would say, from most of the candidates about the issues on this very real threat that the world is facing, France especially, being so close to the Daesh threat, as it's called here, the ISIS threat.
Afshin, I'd like to hear your opinion on the fact that there could be a Clinton and a Bush on the ballot paper. I mean, sure. As Philippe pointed out, there are 300 million people in the United States.
Right, no, that's right. And one of the interesting, the old axioms of American politics and at the presidential level of the past sort of 20, 30 years has been Democrats fall in love and Republicans fall in line, right? But it has reversed this time. Because this time Democrats have fallen in line behind Hillary Clinton's candidacy, which is the inevitable candidacy, but Republicans are looking for love. And Jeb Bush has his hands full because you've got 16+ candidates going from all different directions, and that has reversed. But I think in general, it doesn't show well to the outside world when you have a Clinton and a Bush, on the ballot. But the reality is that we still have a long way to go in these presidential elections. These presidential elections can surprise you. Remember the inevitability of Hillary Clinton's candidacy in 2007. before she was upended by President Barack Obama. So we have a long way to go.
Is it going to be inevitable this time around, though?
I think Hillary's candidacy is probably more inevitable this time around than it was in 2007, absolutely.
Okay, looking at some of the serious issues that were debated yesterday on Thursday night, talk of immigration. I mean, we still hear talk of building a wall, Jeb Bush talking about legalizing undocumented immigrants, but not giving them a pathway to citizenship, Trump making derogatory statements about Mexicans and other Central Americans. Did we hear anything serious?
I think we started, Jeb Bush, has a serious, immigration policy. And I think John Kasich even alluded to some of this, and not on immigration, but he alluded to this idea that, as Republicans, they need to find, humane answers to some of these issues that are tearing, apart, families, some of these issues that are, and it's not enough to simply say, let's erect a wall, and that may get you a 15 to 20% bump from, what the gentleman in the UK was referring to as the anti-establishment, sort of populist, anti-immigrant strain, because that does exist here. But the reality is the broad majority of the American public don't embrace those kind of, radical ideas. And I think we started to see it in Jeb Bush's statements, but I think in Jeb Bush's policies in general, you see a more humane immigration policy.
And it's very early days. We're going to see those announcements being refined and changed as we go along to the election.
Yes, we will, absolutely.
Okay, we're going to get to our final question. And that final question is, which I'm going to put to the whole panel, and that is, what's the next big international story? Let's start with you, Weihua.
Well, I think for the U.S. probably to see if the U.S. Congress really going to reject this Iran deal. But I think from the Chinese journalist perspective, I would very much like to see what's going to happen at the Xi-Obama meeting in September.
Are you expecting something major to be announced?
Well, I think the message is very important rather than the concrete deliverables. I think it's only the top leaders who can deliver those messages, and then their governments can work on it. That needs their direction. No one else can do that for them.
Okay, Leela, what's the view from Paris? What's the next big international story?
I think the next big international story, which is actually starting to play up right now, is the Shiite-Sunni power play that's going to take place, and especially post the Iran nuclear deal. Really, never a week goes by without some development on this very broad power play, really, that we're going to see. Just today, the French daily newspaper reported that 2 French warships, which were originally bought by Russia, but the deal was scrapped by Paris over concerns of Russia's involvement in the Ukraine crisis, that Egypt and Saudi Arabia were very keen to buy these warships as part of an Arab force that they intend to build in the region to counter Shiite Iran's influence. So, this is definitely the big story, probably for the next decade.
Philippe?
I think the next big story is what happens when the US raises interest rates, as it's likely to do in the second half of this year. If you remember when there was, they started to taper quantitative easing, the so-called taper tantrum that occurred with emerging markets seizing up. And I think that having lived with near zero US interest rates for many, many years, that the reaction of both financial markets and the global economy is unpredictable. Are we going to have an emerging markets crisis? How strong really is the US economy? Does that lead to big exchange rate moves, particularly between the dollar and the euro, but also potentially between China and the US, or putting pressure on that exchange rate? I think that is going to be the big economic story of the second half of the year.
Afshin, you get the last word.
Sure. I think it's probably a story that won't make the headlines, but I think there's a new political party that's forming around the world, and I call it the Party of No. There are rejectionists from the left and the right. Some of that you see in Donald Trump, channeled through Donald Trump, who are simply saying the way the existing order is not working. And we're going to see those rejectionists from the left and the right upending political orders. They're not going to probably win elections, but they're going to influence elections across the world.
We're seeing that on the Democrat side as well. Bernie Sanders.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Bernie Sanders is part of this Party of No.
Okay. We're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat.